Okay, our last speaker for the session is George Justison, who's clinical manager at the University of Colorado Hospital. George is an active researcher and international presenter and author of more than 30 peer-reviewed articles. His research focus is on goal-directed perfusion and quality and improvement science. Today, he'll talk to us about goal-directed perfusion and machine learning. Thank you, George.
Thank you, everyone. Certainly in our society today, there's a lot of topics and a lot of discussion about artificial intelligence and its impact on our lives. And today we're going to share with you our experience at University of Colorado with machine learning and goal-directed perfusion, and present to you a way that we can use this as a quality improvement tool in our practice. So these are my disclosures. I am not an AI expert. Okay. So when we talk about cardiac surgery-associated acute kidney injury, it's a constellation of complex interrelated issues. There's many important elements that may not fit traditional linear regression models. And this is a combination of non-modifiable patient risk factors, as well as modifiable risk factors like anemia, transfusion, low mean arterial pressure, as well as goal-directed perfusion, low oxygen delivery during cardiopulmonary bypass. There's been several studies, a lot of studies actually, looking at machine learning and cardiac surgery, and a lot of different methodologies of machine learning. This is a good paper that compares some of those different methodologies or techniques. Probably the best method for predicting acute kidney injury, according to this paper, is what they call an ensemble method. It's a method of combining random forest plots with extreme gradient boosting. However, random forest plots and XG boost very similar in their ability to predict acute kidney injury. One of the interesting features from a quality improvement nerd like myself is the ability for machine learning to give us what we call ranking of importance or importance features. And I know it's nearly impossible to see that graphed, but in this study in cardiac surgery associated AKI, here were their top 15 things from their machine learning exercise that predicted acute kidney injury. Intraoperative urine output was number one. Interestingly, packed red blood cell transfusion, hemoglobin 2 and 3. This study included the bypass period where they excluded just like the first 10 minutes of cardiopulmonary bypass due to noise of their signals. But their input was just what data they could collect intraoperatively off of the hemodynamic monitor. Unfortunately, it did not include any cardiopulmonary bypass data, flows, oxygen delivery, etc. A more excellent analysis by our host here, Richard. This was done in pediatric cases. This was 396 cases. Where they used random forest plots and listed their top 10 importance features, number one being age, number two, cardiopulmonary bypass time. But if we go down the list there, we see oxygen delivery less than 350 mLs per minute per meter squared in their top 10 list. And this is just an example of how the logistic happens in random forest plots. It's a series of nodes and decisions to predict an outcome. This paper published in 2023 in the Kidney Disease and Health illustrated to us the importance of combining preoperative, intraoperative, and postoperative variables in our machine learning algorithms. And the reason that we see, differences in all these studies is the answer you get is dependent on the data that you put into the model. So it's very important to understand when you read papers on machine learning is what was contained in their original data set. So the whole purpose of our exercise goes back to a statement that Dr. Kramer from Maine Medical Center, many of you know him. He has spoken a lot on acute kidney injury, but he did a great review of artificial intelligence in cardiac surgery at the last CREF meeting in 2023. And one of the things I took away from that was his conclusion that machine learning has the potential to inform the care team in real time of the likelihood of an adverse event occurring in their patient. And so that drove us for our analysis. Our primary hypothesis was that can we use machine learning algorithms to illustrate the importance of oxygen delivery derived parameters compared to other risk factors in predicting acute kidney injury. But more specifically today, I want to focus on our secondary objectives is how can we use this as a quality improvement tool, and how can we use it to provide a framework for patient-specific dynamic dashboards during cardiopulmonary bypass. So this is our data set. This is our GDP data set at the University of Colorado. It contains 44 variables. There's 17 pre-bypass factors. There are 16 elements that we capture during cardiopulmonary bypass, and the bold highlighted elements are what we consider our goal-directed perfusion elements. There are 11 post-bypass, so a total of 44 variables went into our model. And we used extreme gradient boosting, or XGBoost, which incorporates supervised machine learning. And what it does is it takes weak prediction models, puts them together to make a collectively strong model at predicting your outcome. And you take a portion of your data set to train this model, and then another portion to validate the model itself. So we took 2,058 cases. This is the breakdown of these cases. As you can see, our case mix is probably slightly different than yours, but we are an aortic-centric program. And went through XGBoost machine learning. We used 20% of the cases to train the model, 80% for validation, and we had an accuracy of predicting AKI greater than 99%. Our AKI rate during this time period was 22%. If we adjust that for preoperative renal dysfunction, we have an adjusted AKI rate of about 7.4%. And we list the top 15 attributes by importance. So when we look at all cases, this is all 2,058 cases, clearly the most important factor in predicting acute kidney injury in this data set was the total packed red blood cell transfusion volume, followed by auto transfusion volume on cardiopulmonary bypass, which we use as an indicator or measure of intraoperative bleeding. And then we see in 3 and 4 spots both the mean DO2 on bypass and the nadir DO2. If we go further down the list, other GDP elements that we see, the time that the mean arterial pressure is less than 55, the mean arterial pressure on bypass, and this mean DO2 VCO2 ratio. So for those of you not familiar with this, this is the oxygen delivery to the carbon dioxide production rate. And this is an indication of adequacy of oxygen delivery for the patient's metabolic rate. And this slide is specifically for you, Rob. So since you asked me this at AMSECT, so this is the difference between our AKI patients and our non-AKI patients. You can see that patients that received AKI, had AKI, I should say, received almost 3 times more packed red blood cells. They had higher ATS volume during bypass, as well as lower mean DO2, nadir DO2. What's interesting is as we break this group down into specific case types or subsets, the importance ranking changes. Okay, so this is CABG patients, for example, compared to all cases. And now our most important feature is baseline hemoglobin. And packed red blood cell transfusion falls to number 2. Moving significantly up the list is this metric that we call the time below DO2 VCO2 ratio less than 5. And so this really was not too much of a surprise to me, as we know the DO2 relative to the patient metabolic rate, so that's the DO2 VCO2 ratio, is more predictive in our experience of AKI than the absolute DO2 value itself. And when you combine that with the area under the curve, which is the time below that threshold, then this becomes a really important predictor in CABG patients, right, of AKI. And indeed, you can see in this graph in CABG patients, not only did the patients who had AKI have lower pre-bypass or pre-operative hemoglobin value, they received more transfusion, and they spent almost twice as much time with a DO2 VCO2 ratio less than 5. So the average was 21 minutes in patients who experienced AKI, and they also had longer bypass time as well. As you can see, we're not a very fast institution. So this is an important paper in all of this. This is from Marco Ranucci, and this was published last year. And this is a multifactorial dynamic perfusion index. And what's important from this paper from Marco is the shape of these risk curves, okay? And so, for example, you will see here when you look at nadir hematocrit, right, not all of these are a linear relationship. There's a sweet spot, right, between 30 and 35 hematocrit that has a lower risk of AKI. We see, oh, getting ahead of myself here. We see another sweet spot in the mean arterial pressure, for example. Time series elements like the area under the curve or the critical DO2 exposure time have a peak and then plateau. So once you reach a certain number of minutes or area under the curve, then the risk stabilizes. It does not go up any further. All right. So we are a Spectrum Viper user, and within Spectrum software, there is this ability to create what we call critical care scores. And critical care scores allow you to select your channel, any continuous channel or laboratory value. And what's the advantage of this is not only can we pick a parameter and set a threshold, but we can also manipulate the shape of that curve, whether it's a linear relationship, whether it's a normally distributed value, etc. And then based on our machine learning, we can assign a weight for that. For example, we know that avoiding arterial blood hyperthermia is also a risk factor for AKI, but it is a much lower priority than our DO2 VCO2 ratio, which we rate higher. So by setting up all these GDP parameters then, we can create a critical care score, which displays in our heads-up dashboard like this as a GDP number. And the value of this GDP number is it is constantly, simultaneously measuring all of these parameters and giving you a single-digit feedback score. So as everything is within those design parameters, then you have a score of 100%. As you go out of range, you will see that the score decreases. And then you also will highlight then what is that parameter that is causing that score to decrease. And so what this allows is it reduces the cognitive workload of the perfusionist. Instead of monitoring 13 different parameters on bypass and being a distraction, into a monitoring, I call it like a lane departure control for perfusion, right? So you have your car with lane departure control and it jiggles the wheels and it tells you to get back in your lane. Same thing. And so this shows up not only on our gauge bar on the heart-lung machine, but it also shows up in our remote monitoring in live view. And then there are some parameters like the DO2 area under the curve that once you reach a certain threshold, it's subtracted from this number and you never gain those points back. All right, so what have we seen in our early experience with this? So if we look at our first 3 months of implementing this, on the left here, what you see is our DO2 area under the curve. And what we see in the first 3 months is not only a reduction in the median area under the curve, but also look at the amplitude. So this is the variation between perfusionists with like cases. So not only a reduction in the area under the curve, but a reduction in variation between staff. And we see that also in our average nadir DO2. So if you look at the first month, July, quite a big spread between perfusionists of what their average nadir DO2 on bypass was. As we get more familiar with the score and time goes on, that spread between perfusion staff members got smaller and smaller. And it also reduced overcorrection of DO2. Our time mapped below 55, even though there's still some variation in spread, we reduced that from 10 minutes to 4.5 minutes. So having a heads-up display like this directed by machine learning is a great tool that we find for reducing variation within our practice, but more specifically, reducing variation between team members. And this becomes more important as our workload diversifies and we spend more and more time not sitting behind the heart-lung machine every single day. So in conclusion, machine learning identified the importance of nonlinear time series GDP elements, and it helped us to direct resources and attention to modifiable strategies to optimize our outcome. It can be used as a basis to develop real-time automated perfusion workflow risk stratification to reduce the cognitive workload and perfusion variation to improve cardiac surgery AKI outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you, George. That was a fantastic talk. Questions from the floor? While the microphone goes there, I guess an obvious question is, that's great. I mean, I think the live dashboard is fantastic to kind of reduce reaction times and variability. it's an easy trial to do, right? I mean, can we do our RCT to look at live dashboard use versus standard of care to see what, pick some patients' health outcomes like AKI outcomes or something? Is that something you're thinking about doing?
Yeah, I think it's something that definitely needs to be done. We need to do, a randomized trial. But I think if we look at just our own practice, we can see that there clearly is some reduction and variation. So our observation is that, it had about a 20% reduction in stage 1 AKI during that time period, which is, certainly that we know as perfusionists is probably our biggest impact on AKI.
All right. Thank you, George, for this talk and your previous talk. I really appreciated both of those. What you got me thinking about during this presentation was you listed all of those variables that you wanted to feed into your AI system or your machine learning system. And one of your baseline characteristics was cerebral nears. And I'd be curious to know why it didn't appear that cerebral nears was part of the machine learning later on. So if you could comment on that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, so, we collect that data, we collect baseline, we collect what our average nears is, what our nadir nears is. And when we specifically looked at acute kidney injury, it did not rise up to the level of importance. Now, one of the other things that you saw on that list is postoperative delirium. So that's one of our other outcome metrics. And so we need to run this same machine learning algorithm with delirium being the outcome and then see where that populates in that importance list.
Yeah, thank
Great,
you.
great information.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Thank you. I thought that, this is, you're talking about AKI, but I think a lot of us also think that like when the nears go down, it's probably because of the blood pressure or not enough hemoglobin or flow, in that it very likely is similar to what's going on in the brain and in the kidney. So I appreciate your comment. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Yeah, great information. I love that. I want to make sure I'm understanding one aspect of it. Obviously, we want to maintain our flows and have that characteristic there. But on the CO2 level, are you talking about keeping it in a higher level, like I normally will, keep the pH, where it's lower CO2 and dilate? When you say that -5, what range are you staying in? And one more thing is, what kind of pressure are you showing that you maintain in that aspect too for those results? Thank you.
Sure. So no, that's not what that metric is showing. So this doesn't have to do with PCO2 control. What this has to do is carbon dioxide production index, which we measure through exhaust gas capnography, right? So this is mLs of CO2 produced per minute per meter squared body surface area. And we use the DO2 VCO2 ratio as a surrogate or for a measure of, is oxygen delivery adequate to metabolic rate? Normally, when we talk about oxygen delivery, you would talk about DO2 to oxygen consumption, or the VO2. And in normal physiology, that's about 5 to 1, right? But in cardiopulmonary bypass, we use the carbon dioxide production ratio, not the VO2 ratio metric, because it's more accurate predictor of metabolic rate on cardiopulmonary bypass, because it accounts for both the aerobic and the anaerobic portion.
Great. Thank you for that talk. My question is about surgical awareness and goal-directed perfusion. how do you balance that out when you have these kinds of goals set up, when they may be affecting what's going on at the field, and how you make sure that it's not distracting to the surgical awareness part of the job?
Yeah, so a lot of times, people think, oh, I'm going to have to increase my cardiac index, right, so much to get my oxygen delivery. That's the benefit of having the DO2 VCO2 ratio, is it's not reaching just an arbitrary number, right? It's not just reaching 300 on every patient. It's tailoring that oxygen delivery to their metabolic rate. So like an 80-year-old lady doesn't need an oxygen delivery of 300 to get you a DO2 VCO2 ratio of 5. It's maybe 220 or 240, okay? But you also have to make sure that your surgeons buy in on the physiology of it, right? And you have to cannulate appropriately. You have to make them aware of when you have excursions and how long those excursions are. And, it's a team sport. So.
I have a question right here. How does hemoconcentrator use play into this? A lot of times we have to use one to remove those crystalloid portions of the cardioplegia we're using. Is this affecting our AKI rates?
So I think there's some good, I think it depends on how you use the hemoconcentrator, right? So there's clearly been some publications about excessive hemoconcentrators causing more AKI, being a stimulus for reduced urine production, right? So I think hemoconcentration to restore you back to a euvolemic point is sometimes appropriate. But beyond that, you're probably doing more damage than you are help. And so we used to have hemoconcentrator, right, in our circuit, every case. And so when it's there all the time, right, it's easy to just pop it open and use it. But now today we would go in the direction of promoting more urine output production. And it's important to monitor that in addition to or in conjunction with your hemoconcentrator use.
Thanks, George. Beautiful talk, and I want to congratulate you on a really nice multivariate analysis there. One of the issues that I seem to see with when I see this term goal-directed perfusion, what most people are talking about is DO2I, right? And that's where their conversation stops. So very high on your list of variables that was important was blood transfusion. And I just caution that, sometimes when we're looking at a target, particularly one target, and you're not doing that, I'm happy to say, you have what I would consider an actual goal-directed platform rather than a single variate platform, which I think, needs to be well understood. But every study shows that transfusion is an independent risk factor for both morbidity and mortality. And so I wonder, have you set transfusion triggers and targets? And, because I hear DO2I needs to be somewhere between 260, 310, depending on who you ask. And in order to maintain that, very often, depending on what your hemoglobin is, you're flowing 7 liters, which is probably not possible at all times. So have you set targets and triggers? And again, thanks very much.
Sure. So first part that I want to answer, and this is George standing on his soapbox, right? That if you're just measuring oxygen delivery or DO2I, you are not doing goal-directed perfusion, okay? So your oxygen delivery must be relevant to some patient need metric, whether it's carbon dioxide production or whether it's oxygen consumption index. You have to put it relevant to what the patient's asking you to do, right? And Galletti told us that back in 1962. All right. And then, so secondly, our current transfusion threshold is you should never treat DO2 with a packed red blood cell transfusion if you can avoid that, because that is just going to complicate or increase your morbidity, mortality risk. You need to have an indication that the patient is asking for more oxygen delivery, and you can't provide it by adjusting flow. Okay, either you're volume restricted, you're cannula restricted, you're surgeon restricted, right? But they need to be saying, I need more oxygen. And the best indicator for that is the oxygen extraction ratio, right? So if they're extracting more oxygen, they can't move that oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve anymore, right? That's your indication for a transfusion. So our current transfusion practice says hemoglobin less than 7.5, because we just don't really know what happens in those low extremes of hemoglobin, and an oxygen extraction ratio greater than 35%.
The interest of time, I think, thank you very much, George. That brings us to the close of this session. So please join me in thanking all the speakers for a fantastic round of presentations.